So today we are confronted with the ultimate reluctant disciple. We heard about him in our first reading from the Hebrew Scriptures. His name, of course, is Jonah. We don't often get to hear excerpts from his book, but probably every time we do, you have heard me say that everything we find in the Bible is like everything we find in the newspaper. Headlines on current affairs, weather reports, death notices, recipes, advice columns. And when I say this, as I often do, inevitably someone will say, "Oh, Father Jack, there aren't any comic strips in the Bible." And I answer, "Oh, yes, there is, the book of Jonah. It just hasn't been illustrated yet." Jonah was written to tweak the noses of the Israelites, who wanted to see their enemy, the Ninevites, obliterated by God. But God sends Jonah to convert them, and Jonah does everything he can to get out of going. He is the ultimate reluctant disciple. But God gets him there through the belly of a whale. Could that have been the hold of a pirate ship? And lo and behold, after only one day's preaching, the entire city repents and dons sackcloth and ashes, going so far as to put sackcloth on their cattle. Poor Jonah, all of his hopes for the destruction of Nineveh are dashed. Being a reluctant disciple, he could not thwart God's plan. In the gospel, we hear another more familiar call to discipleship. Last week, we heard John's version, and today it is Mark's version of the call of Simon and Andrew, James and John. Unlike Jonah, they all seem eager to respond to Jesus' invitation to come after me. So eager that the text says they abandoned their nets and followed him. But we know from gospel texts that we will be hearing throughout the ordinary time of the church year that they will not always be such willing and eager disciples. Time and time again, they will show their reluctance to what this call demands. When Jesus tells them to feed the multitudes, they will whine, "It'll cost 200 days' wages just to give each of them a little to eat, and we only have 5 loaves and 2 fish. Or when the woman with the hemorrhage, or the blind man, or the lepers seek out Jesus for healing, they will complain, "Send them away, they are bothering us." Or when Jesus asks them to pray with him in the Garden of Gethsemane the night before he is to die, the first thing you know, they're all snoring. Reluctant disciples indeed, when the rubber meets the road, when there is a price to pay, when there is a cost of discipleship. That phrase, the cost of discipleship, is in fact the title of a seminal book by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German theologian and pastor, who was executed by the Nazis in the waning years of the Third Reich. Teaching in New York City, he could have remained safely in exile, but instead, hearing the call to discipleship, to serve in his homeland, he returned to Germany. Writing to Reinhold Niebuhr, who had taught him at the Union Theological Seminary, he said this, "I have come to the conclusion that I made a mistake in coming to America. I must live through this difficult period in our national history with the people of Germany. I will have no right to participate in the reconstruction of Christian life in Germany after the war if I do not share the trials of this time with my people. Christians in Germany will have to face the terrible alternative of either willing the defeat of their nation in order that Christian civilization may survive, or willing the victory of their nation and thereby destroying civilization. I know which of these alternatives I must choose, but I cannot make that choice from security." And so he returned home to serve and to die, the cost of discipleship. In our own time and place, we are witnessing the cost of discipleship in the lives of those dealing firsthand with this pandemic. Medical workers, first responders, essential personnel who literally put their lives on the line day after day for others, for strangers. We are acutely aware of how this global pandemic has changed our lives and our world. It has upended our schedules and plans and kept us at home living behind masks. It dominates the newscape. It has overwhelmed ICUs and hospitals all across the country. It has impacted schools and teachers and their students. It has crippled businesses and the economy. The list goes on and on. No aspect of our lives has been left untouched. And at the end, there's that awful death toll now towering over 400,000. that ever-increasing list of names that have been taken from us before their time. In his recently published book, Let Us Dream, The Path to a Better Future, Pope Francis discusses this current global pandemic. He notes, "The crisis may seem special because it affects most of humankind, but it is only special in how visible it is." He says this, "There are 1,000 other crises that are just as dire, but just far enough from some of us that we can act as if they don't exist. Think, for example, of the wars scattered across different parts of the world, of the production and trade of weapons, of the hundreds of thousands of refugees fleeing poverty, hunger, and the lack of opportunity, of climate change. These tragedies may seem distant from us as part of the daily news that sadly fails to move us to change our agendas and priorities. But like the COVID crisis, they affect the whole of humanity." Pope Francis reminds us that there are all these other unseen viruses that rob the world and have been doing so for so long that we often seem inured to their presence, but they are just as threatening, just as deadly. The virus of hate, the virus of intolerance, the virus of racism, the virus of poverty, the virus of violence, the virus of war, the virus of inequality, the virus of denial, the virus of destruction in all its forms. This past week, we celebrated the national holiday in honor of the late Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr., and we witnessed the inauguration of the 46th President of the United States. Both these events offered words from history and words from the future, calling us to have hope, to have courage, to have compassion. In other words, calling us to remember the call to discipleship we all received at our baptism. Sisters and brothers, we are all called to be first responders, healers, guardians of peace and justice. We may not work in a hospital, but we are called to be healers. We may not wear a badge or carry a gun, but we are called to uphold the peace and work for justice. We may not think of ourselves as essential workers, working from home and making more than minimum wage, but every one of us is essential in confronting the hidden viruses that infect society and destroy lives. Like Jonah, like Peter and Andrew, like James and John, we are now being called and being sent into the world, a world like we have never seen before. We must listen with our hearts in order to know to what we are being called and where we are being sent. May we not be reluctant disciples, but disciples who are always ready and eager and who are never afraid to pay the cost of discipleship.